Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 12th Triennial Conference on the History of Women Religious. My name is Maggie McGinnis, and I'm Professor Emerita in the Department of Religion at LaSalle University, and I'm also co-chair of the program committee for this year's conference, the theme of which is Diversity and Dignity Across Time and Place. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker in a minute, but first just a couple of things. I want to thank the members of this conference's program committee. Katie Budgish, Heidi McDonald. Katie, are you here? Oh, hi, Katie. Heidi McDonald, who I don't think is here. Donna Maria Moses, OP, who is not here. Jacqueline Willie Romero, who's back there, and my co-chair, Carol Coburn, over here. We also would like to extend a special thanks to the co-sponsors and collaborators of this conference, including St. Mary's College and the Center for Spirituality at St. Mary's, the University of Notre Dame's Medieval Institute, and Amber Kirk and the entire events and operations teams here at Notre Dame's Conference Center, who are going to work very hard behind the scenes to make sure that this runs very smoothly in a post-COVID world. I mean, for a lot of us, this is the first conference, right, since 2019. So for the past year or so, we've been looking very much forward to having Diane Batts-Morrow of the University of Georgia with us to start off the conference. And Diane had a keynote prepared entitled Making a Way Out of Nowhere, The Oblate Sisters of Providence Pursue Higher Education Under Jim Crow. Diane is a longtime participant at CHWR, has served on several program committees, has won the book award, and is a good friend to many of us. As many of you might know, Diane fell ill last month, and she is steadily recovering, but she did have to withdraw from the conference. And I'm sure she would appreciate any prayers that you would like to send her way. Kathleen Sprows Cummings graciously offered to fill in and give the opening keynote, and so I'm going to introduce her now, and she's asked for a pretty brief introduction so that we have time for questions and discussion after this. Most of you know her, and if you don't, you will know Kathleen Sprows Cummings by Wednesday at noon, I think. She is the Reverend John A. O'Brien Collegiate Professor of American Studies and History and the William W. and Anna Jean Cushwa Director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism here at the University of Notre Dame, where she earned her PhD in history. Her teaching and research focus on the history of women, Catholicism, and American religion. After completing her doctorate at Notre Dame, she spent 2 years as a Lilly Fellow at Valparaiso University, and then returned to Notre Dame as Associate Director of the Cushwa Center, where she was appointed director in 2012. Her list of achievements is way too long to read here and finish by 8:15, but just to remind those of you, she is the author most recently of A Saint of Our Own, How the Quest for a Holy Hero Helped Catholics Become American, which was published in 2019 by UNC Press. In 2009, she published New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholicism in the Progressive Area, also with UNC, and both those books won awards from the Catholic Press Association in several categories. With Scott Appleby, she co-edited the volume Catholics in the American Century, Recasting Narratives of U.S. History. With Timothy Mattavina and Robert Orsi, she co-edited Catholics in the Vatican II Era, Local Histories of a Global Event, and she edited Matteo Benasco's Roman Sources for the History of American Catholicism, 1763 to 1939. Most recently, in December of 2019, Dr. Cummings received a grant within Notre Dame's Church Sexual Abuse Crisis Research Grant Program to co-direct a project called Gender, Sex, and Power toward a history of clergy sex abuse in the U.S. Catholic Church. The title of her talk tonight is Monumental Women, Remembering Catholic Sisters at Notre Dame and in America. So please join me in welcoming Kathleen Sprows Cummings to the podium.
Thank you so much, Maggie, for that introduction. I would normally at this point thank the people who invited me, but since that is myself, I'm going to skip that over. I am truly sorry that Diane Batsmaro cannot be here with us as she is. There was some hope at a point that she could present via Zoom, but even that was really not viable. So I told her, do not worry, focus on healing, and I can pinch hit. So I am pleased to do that. And particularly because I do think what some of my recent research has focused on really does fit into our conference theme of diversity and dignity across time and place. I'm very interested in representations of Catholic sisters on landscapes, both locally and nationally. And particularly what I want to talk about is the representations of the Sisters of the Holy Cross on this campus, but also it's a story that's deeply intertwined with the history of St. Mary's College and the Sisters of Holy Cross there. And so I'm just really delighted that we have such close relationships with St. Mary's College, so many co-sponsors, and so many papers on the program dealing with St. Mary's College. So I'm really excited to see that. I'm also grateful, I'm having a little, this is usually where I thank the program committee and I thank the Cushwa staff. I don't have to do that, that's not, but I'm so grateful. A conference of this magnitude, as you all know, takes a really long time to plan. And I just do want to single out Jacqueline Willie Romero, Jacqueline, who was on the program committee, but is also the liaison with the Cushwa Center. She's been a postdoctoral fellow at the Cushwa Center. It's just done heroic work. So thank you, Jacqueline. This conference is a return home in an important way. And whether some of you have been to every single HWR conference or this is your first one, I just want to extend a warm welcome and just start by thinking a little bit about how we got here. And this is the 12th Triennial Conference, and I want to begin by talking about the first. Actually, this is the second time Notre Dame, I know a lot of you were here in 2007 when the Cushwa Center hosted this. I was walking over here and I was remembering that I was 8 months pregnant when I hosted that conference. And so that child is now entering high school. So this is the passage of time but I want to go further back to 20 years before that, to 1987. There we go. To 1987, when Jay Dolan, the founding director of the Cushwa Center, convened with funding from the Lilly Endowment a group of 32 historians of women's religious communities, as well as leading historians in U.S. women's and religious history, to discuss how Catholic sisters might be more integrated into larger narratives of U.S. history. So this is an excerpt from the Cushwa Center newsletter explaining that gathering. I know Judith Satera is here. Is anyone else here that was here on that? We've got over there? Yes. Oh, Mary. Yes. Hi. And who's in the back there? Yeah. Welcome back and thank you. So that first gathering was, the majority were women who were members of religious communities. Many of them held academic positions at colleges founded by their respective communities. And there were just a handful of non-sisters present. In addition to Professor Dolan, the sisters were joined by Fordham's Reverend James Hennessy and Notre Dame's Professor Philip Gleason. Also participating in the conversation were two female historians who were not members of religious communities, Margaret Susan Thompson of Syracuse, who often attends this conference, and Catherine Kish-Sklar of UCLA, then one of the preeminent scholars in the emerging field of U.S. women's history. That gathering resulted in the establishment of the History of Women Religious Network, which published its first newsletter the next year, founded separately from the Cushwa Center, and overseen by Sister Karen Kennelly, who's pictured in the photo here. The conference met for the first time at the College of St. Catherine in St. Paul, Minnesota, from June 25th to 27th, 1989. So the exact same dates that we're meeting now. There were over 200 participants, historians, activists, other interested persons, people from Canada, Australia, the Philippines, and France, representing 31 different states. And that was recognized as the first conference of its kind to be devoted solely to the history of women religious. There were 21 people there who were not members of religious communities. There were 3 men, so just looking out, I see a lot more men here than were there. And it represented 104 canonically distinct congregations. Since 1989, this conference has met every 3 years, most recently at St. Mary's College in 2019. And I know many of you were there and were remembering that. Honestly, my goal for tonight is to get through this without a tornado hitting campus. We had, for those of you who were not there, we had not 1, but 2 trips to the basement on that conference. So I see a clear sky. I think we're going to be okay. But again, I'm particularly grateful to be able to talk about a bridge, an important bridge between St. Mary's campus and the University of Notre Dame, an intertwined history that is not reflected on our campus landscape, and in fact has really been erased. And it's something that I, as a historian who's been studying women's invisibility in Catholic institutions for a quarter century, have really just started to discover myself. I've presented some of this material to audiences related to the Congregation of Holy Cross. I'm grateful to Dan Horan, the director of the Center for Spirituality at St. Mary's, who invited me to present some of this. I've also presented at St. Edward's University and some places at Notre Dame. But it's particularly exciting to me to be presenting to a group that includes so many historians and specialists. And spoiler alert, some of this story reveals that the priests of the Congregation of the Holy Cross didn't always have the best interests of Sisters of the Holy Cross in mind. And when I present this to non-specialists, everyone gasps. And of course we say, yes, no, we know, we all write about this kind of thing. But in any case, this is related to a national conversation. I am going to end by talking about the local landscape, the University of Notre Dame, but I'm mapping it onto this broader conversation we're having in the United States and in the United Kingdom and other places about monuments, about who we remember in our public landscapes and why, and what that signifies and how those change. So it's interesting that our conference image is related to the 5 members of the Adorers of the Blood of Christ who were killed in Liberia in 1992, and all women who have worked for social justice is what the memorial is designated. But I do want to note that it does have to do with war and conflict, which, as we'll see, is not unusual when it comes to monuments. So just keep that in mind. So this is, as I said, a conversation that we've been having, very polarizing, often very intense conversation that can sometimes be frustrating to historians. This meme began circulating a couple years ago, and I love to use it in my classes. It emerged in response to the allegation that removing particularly Confederate memorials was somehow tantamount to erasing history. And of course, we know that studying history is very complicated and that monuments always distort, always admit they only tell part of the story. And so that's something that I think, as frustrating as these conversations can often be to working historians, it's also led to some very exciting initiatives. For example, the Mellon Foundation is devoting millions of dollars to help change the landscape in America. And they sponsored, one of their early projects was a national monument audit sponsored by the Monument Lab in Philadelphia. It's a fascinating report that used crowdsourcing to determine who exactly is honored in the United States and why, who are the most popular people, and defines monument as a statement of power and presence in public. I do urge you to look at the whole report. It's really fascinating. You could spend a long time, but these are the key findings. Number one, monuments have always changed. Our priorities change as our values change and who we honor changes. Again, shocker, the monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. The most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest, and the story of the United States, as told by our current monuments, misrepresents our history. So there are lots of directions to take this conversation. There's lots of just horrific things. The top 50 people commemorated in monuments in the United States, 50 of the top 50, 50% of them enslaved other people. So there is this is part of our racial reckoning. In terms of gender, do you know that there are more monuments in the United States dedicated to mermaids, 22, than there are to US congressmen, 2. So clearly, it would be funny if it weren't so appalling. This graphic is really remarkable. The top 50 people recognized in American monuments. Now, the first several are recognizable enough. We see a Catholic saint popping up in the fifth most popular monument, Francis of Assisi. We have to go all the way to number 18 to get the first woman, and it's Joan of Arc. Again, related to war and conquest, Joan emerged as a symbol of French nationalism in the late 19th century, which provided momentum for beatification, and she became very popular during World War I and was canonized immediately after that. Also pictured are Harriet Tubman and Sacagawea. So there are 3 of the top 50 that are represented by, that represent women. This is changing, and so the Mellon Foundation and others are trying to reimagine this landscape, so it has led to things like the Harriet Tubman statue, which was installed in Philadelphia this past January. And in New York City, moving on to my particular subject with Catholic sisters who are represented in the landscape, Frances Cabrini, a statue of Frances Cabrini was installed at Battery Park City in Manhattan on Columbus Day 2020. Incidentally, that was also the same day that Colorado celebrated for the first time Cabrini Day. Renaming, so Columbus Day has been renamed Indigenous Peoples Day in various places, but Colorado decided to name it Cabrini Day, recognizing Frances Cabrini's work in that state, and it became the first state holiday named after a woman. So it is a mandated paid state holiday in Colorado. So Frances Cabrini is kind of up and coming. It's not surprising that we see many Catholic saints. In the list of the top 50 women, there is only, Cabrini does not appear, Elizabeth Ann Seton does. And I know this in the book that Maggie mentioned, my most recent book. Seton wound up on the cover because she is the most popular American Catholic saint. There are institutions named after her in almost every single diocese. You have to go, the next one is Cabrini, but she has far fewer representations. So Elizabeth Ann Seton, we could talk about her quite a bit, of course, but I want to use this to move into what is, I believe, the most significant, the largest monument recognizing the work of women religious. Seton's congregation, the Daughters of Charity, sent the largest number of Catholic nursing sisters to nurse in the Civil War. 270 Daughters of Charity were enlisted nurses in the Civil War. This was after Seton's death, but it is her congregation, and particularly since her founding congregation was at Emmitsburg, they were particularly prominent at the Battle of Gettysburg. So I think the most significant permanent memorial in the United States is not, when we talk about Catholic sisters, is not to one sister, but to a group of sisters, again, related to war and conquest. So what's pictured here is the Nuns of the Battlefield Monument. Who's seen this? Just a show of hands. Okay, all right, so it's in Washington, D.C., across from St. Matthew's Cathedral. And it was dedicated on September 20th, 1924. And I just want to give a little bit of the story of how this monument came to be. It was almost single-handedly the result of an effort of a laywoman named Ellen Ryan Jolly. The monument itself is designed by an Irish-born artist named Jerome O'Connor, well known for his lifelike portraits in bronze. Again, Rhode Island and M Street, across from St. Matthew's Cathedral, which is right in the Embassy District. There are life-size figures of 12 sisters, each representing communities of women religious. I said the Daughters of Charity, the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Sisters of Mercy, the Sisters of St. Joseph, Ursulines, Dominicans. And it's flanked by 2 allegorical figures, an angel of patriotism on the north end and an angel of peace on the south. The inscriptions read, "They comforted the dying, nursed the wounded, carried hope to the imprisoned, gave in his name a drink of water to the thirsty, to the memory and honor of the various orders of sisters who gave their services as nurses on the battlefields and hospitals in the Civil War." I want to talk a little bit about the person who was behind this monument, Ellen Ryan Jolly. Pictured here is Mrs. Jolly, who is an American-born daughter of Irish immigrants. She had been taught by the Sisters of Mercy, from whom she supposedly heard many, many tales of sisters who had nursed in the Civil War. She was from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and in 2014 became president of the Ladies Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, an organization that still exists today, although they've dropped auxiliary, and they're actually very important friends and benefactors of the Cushwa Center. Jolly became president in 1914, and she was motivated by what she saw as a twin injustice. In 1910, at the Battle of Gettysburg, there was a memorial erected to Father William Corby of the Congregation of Holy Cross, former president of Notre Dame, superior general of the congregation, who had served as one of many priests of the Holy Cross who served as a chaplain in the Civil War. Corby ministered with the Fighting 69th at Gettysburg, and there was a statue of him placed on the battlefield at Gettysburg. A year later, on Memorial Day 1911, a replica of Corby's Gettysburg Monument was unveiled at Notre Dame. It stands upon a rock, which was brought from the Gettysburg battlefield and sits right outside Corby Hall, where the Holy Cross religious live on campus. So there were many statues being erected of Corby, but also other chaplains. And Jolly also knew that in 1914, the Red Cross building in Washington, D.C. was dedicated to the memory of women nurses in the Civil War, like Clara Barton. So Jolly sensed a disconnect. Priests are getting recognized, secular nurses are getting recognized. What about the women who, the nearly 1,000 in her estimation, sister nurses from Catholic religious congregations across the nation who had served as nurses? As I said, she was president of the Ladies Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. She estimated that about 93% of Civil War nurses had either been born in Ireland or were daughters of Irish immigrants. So she saw this very much as an Irish story, not only a Catholic story. She overestimated a little bit, but not by much. I think it's closer to about 80%. So she was interested in getting markers to commemorate this service, but the War Department stipulated that absolute proof of the service rendered by nuns in the Civil War had to be procured before any site could be chosen or any approval considered. So in what was a heroic feat of archival research, she single-handedly identified and validated the service of almost 1,000 sister nurses from Catholic religious congregations across the nation. She originally wanted the memorial in Arlington Cemetery, but could not get it approved by the War Department. It was officially prohibited on the grounds that who were not officially interred there. So Arlington was not an option, but eventually she got approval for the site on which it currently rests, also in the nation's capital, but across town. Her research brought her to the University of Notre Dame, where she became good friends with Father John Kavanaugh, CSC, who was president of Notre Dame between 1905 and 1919. Kavanaugh was an Irishman himself, was kind of a history buff, was very supportive of this effort. They became very good friends. Jolly's son actually enrolled as a student at Notre Dame and died in April of 1917 of blood poisoning. And Father Kavanaugh traveled to Rhode Island for his funeral. Father Kavanaugh awarded her an honorary doctorate of law at Notre Dame's commencement in 1918. We're marking the 50th anniversary of the arrival, the direct admission of undergraduate women to Notre Dame this fall. So, but we're also thinking about the many women, many of whom sisters, who earned degrees at Notre Dame in one way or another. And so Jolly, I believe, was the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate. She was very proud of that, and of course, why wouldn't she be? This is not a very good, you can't see it very clearly, but this is at the dedication of the monument. And she's actually wearing her academic garb, her doctoral robe that she got from Notre Dame. And it's Boston's Cardinal O'Connor that is speaking. Jolly published a book called The Nuns of the Battlefield, which, if you're interested in gruesome detail about what went on in hospitals during the Civil War, there's one about Mother Angela Gillespie, who I'll talk about in a minute, of the Sisters of Holy Cross, kind of blood dripping all over her habit. I mean, it could get very, a little bit gory. This is interesting. This is just a page from that book. This is from the section that's dedicated to the Sisters of the Holy Cross. And note how many people were born in Ireland. It truly is an Irish story. Jolly was not only content with the memorial to all the sisters, she wanted markers on graves. And federal law required that the War Department provide markers to any veteran who was buried outside of Arlington. So again, in a rather heroic effort, she made certain that the Sisters of the Holy Cross and people in various communities had markers on their graves. So in November 1919, 50 markers arrived across the street at St. Mary's, commemorating sisters who had served in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and the Great War. This is one of my favorites, Sister M. Lydia Mary Margaret Clifford, who served not only in the Civil War, but also the Spanish-American War, in which she was a medalist. And I haven't been able to verify this, although I'm trying mightily. I believe that, that the sisters received the markers first, and that Father Kavanaugh got the idea for this from Jolly. And if you go to Holy Cross Cemetery on campus, there are about 118 markers on campus for priests who served as chaplains. At this dedication ceremony, again, across the street at St. Mary's in 1919, Kavanaugh praised Jolly for her efforts to recognize these women. And he said, he singled her out as herself the mother of sons. She has always been a true nun in her heart, an eloquent and zealous high priestess of faith and patriotism. Though for reasons of delicacy, he said, I may not mention her name. So we want to turn now to Notre Dame's campus, where Kavanaugh was particularly concerned about women's delicacy and particularly resistant to actually mentioning people's names. So I want to talk about another one of his good friends named Sister Mary Aloysius Mulcair, a woman pictured next to him here who was born Honora Mulcair in Ireland in 1845, the first year of the Irish potato famine, and like so many Sisters of the Holy Cross and other American women religious, left Ireland to join a religious community. Father Kavanaugh was a big fan of Sister Mary Aloysius. They were very good friends, and he was a great admirer of her. According to Father Kavanaugh, he was speaking at her funeral. He said, Sister Aloysius had such ability that she might have been President of the United States. Instead, she taught Notre Dame's minims, grammar school students, the little guys, for over 40 years at St. Edward's Hall. Kavanaugh calculated that only the founder of Notre Dame, Father Edward Sorin, had given more years of service to Notre Dame than Sister Aloysius had. Moreover, he argued only the founder himself could rival her in zeal, enthusiasm, and talent. But, he said, she doesn't need a monument. This is a direct quote. Someone has asked why the world has never erected a monument to any woman. The answer, he said, is that every great man who ever lived is himself a monument to some good woman. Now, Kavanaugh loved monuments, and if we, we could do a little walking tour, and I can show you all the monuments that were placed during the term of his presidency. So this is Father Sorin right on the main quad, the founder. Here's the aforementioned one for Corby. But it wasn't only his confreres. After Father Kavanaugh stepped down as president of the University of Notre Dame, he decided to dedicate himself to continuing the mission of the university, and he did a lot of fundraising. He took the lead when Newt Rockne was killed in a plane crash. He took the lead to erect a building that we can also see on campus, a very prominent building that remains a gymnasium. And again, in some of this is just a brief excerpt from some of the publicity. You can see the masculinity here. Manliness and religion have gone hand in hand in Notre Dame's tradition from Father Sorin on down to the present generation. So the public landscape of Notre Dame still represents this. I started to think about this. I mean, I was thinking about this in terms of our national conversation, of course. But I got an email from an undergraduate woman who is a junior at Notre Dame. She just graduated about a year and a half ago. And she had noticed, she's been on a tour of Notre Dame's campus with her architecture class. And she said, there's an awful lot of depictions of Mary, and that's great. We love Mary. She said, but there's really not that many women represented on campus. And so again, I think about this a lot myself. We were thinking about monuments, and so I knew that women had been here from the beginning, or almost from the beginning, and I wanted to find them. I wanted to think about where they were and were they represented. And what I've actually found is it's not only that they're not represented, they're in some ways actually erased. So I want to move now to finish up the particular story of this campus. And again, I hope you get a chance to walk around and see some of this. these are just a couple. I also, in the classes I teach, I have my students do an assignment called Sacred Spaces on Campus. So they have to go find, and we define sacred very broadly. It doesn't necessarily have to be religious. So, and I teach a course called Notre Dame in America that regularly enrolls about 80 students, which means like I have multiple papers of all these spots on campus, most of which I didn't even know about before my students wrote them. But I just want to share a couple. This is on the facade of Eck Law School. I'm missing the date there, but it was 2009. Frances Xavier Cabrini, not actually a representation of her. I believe this is a reference to her motto, "The world is too small to do all the good that I want to do." She's holding the globe in her hand. So again, Cabrini, she's also up and coming in the nation. This one's interesting. The Elizabeth Ann Seton statue is in Knott Hall. Knott Hall was built in 1988 as one of the first women's halls on campus. And the Knott family is from Baltimore, Maryland. So they dedicated a statue to Seton. This is actually something I'm kind of proud of. When I first found this or first heard about it, Seton was tucked into a back corner of the chapel. And she's now moved out. She's now prominent. She's the first thing you see. So, baby steps. We're kind of getting her a little bit of due. And one of my students told me that the chapel, who lives in Knott Hall, it's actually now a male hall. It switched, which is interesting. But one of my students told me it has been renamed the Elizabeth Ann Seton Chapel, but I haven't verified that. Joan of Arc, the most popular woman in the United States, is also, I think, probably next to Mary, the most popular woman represented on our campus, again, reflecting the primacy of war. This is what's known colloquially as the God Country Notre Dame doors, the east side of the Basilica. It's officially the World War I memorial. I don't have a very up-and-close picture, but you can go see it. It has the names of all the students Notre Dame students who died in World War I. And these niches up the top were left empty. This was dedicated in 1924 on Memorial Day, 8 days after the Ku Klux Klan held a riot in downtown South Bend. And against the orders of their president, Notre Dame students went down and got into a bit of a rumble with some of them. So I think it was kind of must have been a remarkable occasion, a time when the KKK was challenging Catholics' ability to be citizens, so to have this. But nevertheless, there was no money to build statues at that time, so it wasn't until the Second World War, when the art professors didn't have as much to do because so many students were away fighting, that the statue of St. Joan of Arc was placed in the southern niche, and Michael the Archangel was placed in the other. So it's just a little bit about when trying to find the women on campus, women religious represented on campus. But I want to talk now about the Sisters of the Holy Cross. I did know that Sister Aloysius, who I mentioned, was one of literally hundreds of Holy Cross sisters who lived and worked on Notre Dame's campus between 1843 and 1958. I want to make clear that their story is distinct from, although it's obviously intertwined with, the story of the hundreds of the Sisters of the Holy Cross who lived and ministered at St. Mary's and continue, of course, to do so today. There was a separate convent, a separate novitiate even for many years, which was something that the Vatican was mystified by, why we needed two novitiates less than a mile apart. But Kavanaugh and his predecessors. Kavanaugh was not the only, not by a long shot, the only Holy Cross priest who talked about how integral Holy Cross sisters were to the campus on which he had lived and would continue to lead. When the history of Notre Dame is completely written, he predicted, no chapter in that beautiful and brilliant story will be more heroic than the part the sisters have borne in the work. The record of their services, he said, would never be inscribed on monuments of brass or marble, but etched on the hearts of grateful men and written in the book of God. This is something we're all familiar with. So women don't need recognition on earth, Catholic sisters in particular, because they're getting the recognition in heaven. But of course, there's no problem recognizing men for all the work that they did. But so I have lots of these wonderful quotes from every president of the University of Notre Dame until 1958, so including Father Ted Hesburgh, talking about how Notre Dame could never have functioned as an institution, let alone developed into a great university, without the unsubsidized labor that Holy Cross sisters provided for over a century. Yet the story is largely unknown, and apart from two in a series of 30-odd small plaques on the Wall of Honor in the basement of Notre Dame's main building, it is not commemorated on campus. And it is conspicuously absent from a monument that occupies a really important place in Notre Dame's collective historic memory, the Founders Plaque. If you've taken a walk by the lakes, you'll notice this spot that really is truly the heart of campus. Pictured is a replica of the log chapel that was originally constructed by Father Stephen Baden when he did missionary work in this area in the 1830s. And next to it is a plaque on which is inscribed an excerpt from a letter that Edward Sorin wrote to his superior, Basil Moreau, in France, upon arriving at this area in 1842 on a winter landscape. We quote this all the time at Notre Dame, and why not? It is like the most epic founding story ever, because what Sorin talks about is he has a vision for a university that cannot fail to succeed and will become a powerful means for good. We actually misquote it all the time. It's force for good. One of my colleagues, Father Greg Hake in the French department, actually says the powerful means for good. Just the power, the French word for power, became conflated with force, because force for good and means for good are two kind of different things. But anyway, that's another story. So I was interested in going to the original, well, not the original letter, but a translation of the original French that appears in Father Sorin's collected letters. And these are just a few of the omissions that I want to talk about. An ellipse, the very first one. Sorin is very aware that this is the center of the Indian mission, and in fact, right after the part that is inscribed on this plaque, he actually asks his superior if he could be reassigned to beloved Potawatomi. And that's not on the plaque, and actually he wasn't reassigned. He stayed at Notre Dame, so we don't know exactly what happened there. But I think this is a really powerful thing when we're all thinking about what it means to teach and learn on the indigenous and traditional homelands of the Potawatomi and other indigenous people. But for our purposes, I'll focus on the second ellipse, the second omission. Again, this college cannot fail to succeed. It's a wonderful story. It's a bold vision, his confidence, his optimism. But there's a qualification, of course, provided it receive assistance from our good friends in France. And by assistance, of course, he meant money, but he also meant vocations. So I just want to talk about one of the women who was one of the sisters from France. She did not arrive in 1843. Sisters arrived Actually, the first sisters arrived in 1843. Let me mention the final, there's not even ellipses there. It just was something that is just not put on the plaque. Once the sisters come whose presence is so much desired here, they must be prepared not only for domestic work, but also for teaching and perhaps too for the establishment of academy. And who knows, but God has prepared for them here, like at St. Peter's. That was Holy Cross's first mission in the United States. It was in southern Indiana. Some good and devoted novices. So here, right in this momentous moment in our founding history, the founder is talking about how critical sisters would be to the success, but it's not represented. It's left out. So let me just talk briefly. I mean, there were hundreds of women. I'm still learning about them. Couldn't possibly talk about all of them, but I did want to mention these two women who are repeatedly referred to in archival documents and certainly in printed material as Father Sorin's two hands. Mother Mary Ascension was born in France and became electrified in the 1830s by the preaching of Basil Moreau and wanted to follow the mission, to come to the mission in Indiana. Her superiors in France recognized her a woman of just incredible intelligence and actually wanted her to stay in France and become the superior there. But Sorin could be very persuasive, and on one of his recruitment trips, he was able to secure her as one of the people that came here. She didn't die until she lived a very long life in 1901, and she was eulogized as the last of the pioneers. By that point, Father Sorin had died, Father Corby had died, all the pioneers had died, and she was still living. She actually had a special funeral mass in the Church of the Sacred Heart, which by that point the sisters would have had their funerals at St. Mary's. Repeatedly on her Golden Jubilee, other occasions, Salou, Mother Mary Ascension, was talked about someone who did more than any other person to make sure that Notre Dame would evolve into a university in which there would be no tension between science and religion. She was kind of the brains behind the operation that people talked to her about. There is no way, nobody recognizes Mother Mary Ascension's name on campus. She has been completely forgotten. The woman pictured on the right, Mother Angela Eliza Gillespie, also had her vocational story shifted by the magnetism of Father Sorin. Eliza Gillespie was traveling with her mother from her native Ohio to enter the Chicago Sisters of Mercy in 1853 when they stopped at Notre Dame to visit Eliza's brother, Neil Gillespie, who was the first graduate of Notre Dame who had then entered the Congregation of Holy Cross. Father Sorin met Eliza and her mother at the gate and in about 30 seconds decided that Eliza's vocation was not to the Sisters of Mercy, it was to the Sisters of the Holy Cross. And he told her so, that he wanted her to be the directress of St. Mary's Academy. Eliza did pray about it for a couple of days with the Holy Cross, but she did eventually enter and became Mother Angela. And again, with Mother Mary Ascension was one of his two hands. Both women were at the center of a conflict that is foreshadowed by the highlighted part on this omitted text. Now, we trust that when Sorin said the sisters must be prepared not merely for domestic work, but also for teaching, we can believe that he sincerely meant that. But that only extended so far. And when the sisters' educational ministry began to interfere with the financial viability of Notre Dame, he began to change his mind. In 1972, he wrote a letter to the Archbishop of Cincinnati, John Purcell, complaining that up until some 10 or 11 years ago, Holy Cross sisters on campus had performed all the work reserved to females. Many of them had departed for Civil War service. Certainly Mother Angela was instrumental in that. So Sorin hoped that they would eventually come back. But since the close of the war, he told Purcell, the sisters have multiplied their own houses and have been unable to give Notre Dame but half the number of hands really required, thereby creating a permanent expense. Sorin proposed a new solution. He would establish a new congregation entirely devoted to domestic work at Notre Dame. He envisioned outfitting the new congregation in the cap and collar of your Sisters of Charity, Seton's congregation in Cincinnati, and asked Purcell to help recruit candidates so that the new order could grow large enough to supplant both the hired women, at that point he had to hire lay women to do a lot of the domestic work. By forming an order to supply our own ones, Sorin estimated that Notre Dame could save $5,000 annually. This threat alarmed, hurt, devastated the Sisters of the Holy Cross, both at Notre Dame and St. Mary's. Again, there were sisters who had lived here their entire vocational life. One of the people that protested was a sister named Sister M. Compassion, born Margaret Gleason in Ireland, and had served at Notre Dame in its early years. She had also she had also nursed in the Civil War. I, for one, and an Irish sister too, she wrote, am much opposed to the separation, and as much as I love St. Mary's, I'd be willing to spend the rest of my life at ND if by so doing I could preserve the union. Beyond tearing apart the Holy Cross family, she reminded him, Sorin's scheme could very well result in disaster for the sisters. The Sisters of the Holy Cross did not yet have permanent Vatican approval, and therefore, and this was a highly unusual arrangement to have the two separate novitiates. So there was really, the sisters did put together a compromise plan in which they agreed to send enough sisters to supply Notre Dame's domestic needs, even though it would actually require them to hire more domestic help at St. Mary's and their other educational institutions. Sorin agreed to a compromise that entailed opening a second Holy Cross novitiate at Notre Dame. This move, he said, was to save our dear congregation money and permanent help. And as long as this annex to St. Mary's produced enough vocations to meet Notre Dame's needs, he would not resort to forming a separate community. So this is the point, as I alluded to, people say, oh, wow, what a power play. I can't believe he did that. And we all say, yeah, no, this happens. We see this in every congregation. This episode, as we know, is not unique, but it's one chapter in a really complicated and wonderful story about how the Sisters of the Holy Cross earned the ability to make their own decisions about their ministries, their finances, and their leaders. It was really this woman who's a bit of a hero of mine, Mother Augusta Anderson, CSC, also had nursed in the Civil War. She had early on in her religious life been kind of traveled back and forth between St. Mary's Academy and Notre Dame quite a bit. And she also serves for a long time as the bursar of the community. So the lady knew where the money went, and she knew the value that sisters' work was providing. She became a fierce advocate for the independence of the Sisters of the Holy Cross and was instrumental in helping them achieve temporary autonomy in 1889, and then permanent recognition 10 years later. Independence, however, did not change the sisters' commitment to Notre Dame. As I said, they continued to live and work on campus until 1958. At a mass marking the departure of the final Sisters of the Holy Cross from campus, except for 13 stayed behind to that point to work in the laundry and in the infirmary. And I should say sisters did not only perform domestic work, they ran the printing office, they certainly taught the grade school students while that remained open until 1929. They did a whole bunch of things, but by 1958, there was a dining hall, the campus was evolving, and the sisters' work was not as much needed. Father Ted assured them that they and their predecessors would never be forgotten by Notre Dame's administrators, faculty, and students. You have been, he told them, the golden threads woven forever into the tapestry of Notre Dame's life. They certainly have been forgotten. I mean, if anyone is likely to have known this story, it would have been me, let's face it. I mean, I write about this stuff, and this is a story that really, that query by the undergraduate really helped me to think about and uncover. Father Arthur Hope, CSC, who had written Notre Dame's official history after 100 years, and thus appreciated better than anyone the cumulative value of the sisters' 115 years of service, delivered the homily at the departure mass. Hope was almost certainly the author of this remarkable essay, The Sisters Depart, which was published in the Holy Cross Province Review, which he also edited. And this is just an excerpt. He talked about the unbroken chain of labor, the way Notre Dame could not have existed. He alludes to the conflict. Who was to keep the pot boiling at Notre Dame? Who was to make the pies and cook the tough beef? Who would wash and mend and iron? The great pity of this parting, which has long been foreseen and long been postponed, is that a coming generation will forget the debt. Is there any lasting way that Notre Dame's debt can be paid? Thank God, in one sense, there is no way. An earthly payment, a temporal payment, there is none. No human effort, however great and lasting, can recompense the Sisters of the Holy Cross for what they have done for Notre Dame. We see here, again, something we're familiar with, and I think we see in so much of our rhetoric. The higher work is valued in rhetoric, often the less compensated it is in reality. And so, I mean, there's no suggestion of how we can possibly calculate this debt. But I want to think with you about one of Father Hope's parting questions. The Sisters of Holy Cross, who even from an economic point of view have given so much and asked so little, how shall we remember them? And we just have not done a very good job of remembering them at Notre Dame. This is one of my favorite. Dan Horan went with me to visit this grave on like a freezing day in January when I was snapping pictures. But the Sisters of the Holy Cross who lived on campus initially were buried with the priests on the original community cemetery, which was in between the two lakes. It's a very swampy ground, and so it's just a bad idea to have a cemetery on swampy ground, just generally speaking. When it was moved to where the present cemetery is now, by that point, the sisters and the priest were canonically separate. So the sisters, even those who worked at Notre Dame, would have been buried over at St. Mary's. Sister M. Agnelia O'Sullivan, another Irish sister. She's kind of a hero of mine. She worked in the Scholastic Printing Office, which is a magazine that started to be published in 1865. Probably a lot of you have relied on it. It's an invaluable source for Catholic periodical literature. And I think about her and just, we don't even remember the superiors, kind of the towering figures. But I think about these essential workers, the sisters who died in the flu epidemic in 1918, nursing Notre Dame students, the sisters who work in the kitchens, the sisters who spent their entire religious life sewing, mending. So it's just, it's a long and complicated story, and I think that we can do better, certainly starting with designing a more inclusive founder's plaque here at Notre Dame that acknowledges the plurality and the diversity of the people who made this institution what it is today. And of course, we can tell stories about almost any other Catholic institution in the United States and beyond. I want to go back and we'll hope we can have a good discussion and some questions just to these key findings. And I think this is a moment for us as historians of women religious to think about how we can tap into this broader initiative. How can we get sisters remembered in American history more general, not only in our local institutions, but as part of the American story? Yes, the Nuns of the Battlefield Monument is terrific. That was 1924, that we need a new one. We need more. We need sisters who are not represented only in their habits, but but sisters who look like the majority of sisters look like today, represented on our landscape. Monuments have always changed. Monuments are a statement of power and presence in public. We have power now to tell a different story. We have power to be inclusive in all sorts of ways, and I hope that we can think about how to do that. Landscape overwhelming white and male. And the key point that we're just not telling our history very well by the monuments that were represented. I want to end by talking about, so I did write about this in an article that was published in Notre Dame magazine. It's received a lot of engagement, particularly from alumni, but not only. And I want to share, I had a wonderful email from the Honorable Rosie Rios, former Treasurer of the United States. You will remember some of her efforts. She walked into her first day at the Treasury Department and couldn't believe that all our national currency, that there were men all over, only men, and she vowed to change that. She was the one that has led these efforts. She now has moved on. She runs an organization at Harvard that has a number of facets, teachers writing history to be more inclusive in classrooms, but she also is designing a statue initiative that will reimagine the public landscape in the nation's 10 most populous cities across the country and her own hometown of San Francisco. She was educated by the Sisters of the Holy Cross, and she said as a product of 12 years of education with the Holy Cross family, it's refreshing to be re-inspired by the women that you talk about, and I'm committed to their legacies being preserved and introduced for the first time. And here's the quote. This email arrived on Valentine's Day of this year, so it was like the best Valentine's Day present I got. Nothing against, my husband's not super romantic, so the bar wasn't very high. But on February 14th, 2022, Treasurer Rios wrote to me and to Lou Nani, our Vice President for Development, for University Relations, and she said, if I thought that Notre Dame could take a leadership position in giving life to these women as they deserve, what a great example you would serve for the rest of the country and for our Catholic community. And so I want to say that I think the Conference for the History of Women Religious can really seize this moment, not Notre Dame, not only Notre Dame, but all of us to think about as we try to publish, as we do our research, to try to think our public presence and try to tap into this effort to really remember a different story, to tell a different story about the United States. I know it's not only an audience of the United States, but to think more consciously about how we can include these women that we spend so much time studying and writing about, and to share them with a broader audience. Thank you very much. Okay, so normally I would come up and field questions, but I'm already here, so I'm perfectly capable of fielding my own questions. And I will note that there are microphones, so it's helpful to speak in the microphones for the recording. Carol Coburn.
I have a couple things. One is in your research in doing this, I would be curious. You have some statistics in there, and I would be very curious to know the monuments to women that we have, both within the Catholic tradition but also in the broader sense. Who financed those? In other words, is there a pattern there? Were they privately financed, like Jolly, or were they state or local? So that would be one thing, because to me that may show us a pathway forward. The other is, one of the things that I have seen change are stamps. Most recently, I got a series of Title IX stamps. I'd like to know who makes those choices, how that works. In other words, I think we should look for ways that have been successful in terms of donors, but also in terms of who makes those choices, because clearly someone is making those choices. So I throw those two things out there as possible ways to go forward, to shift this and move this into a situation where we are honoring women in a variety of ways. But those two things struck me first.
That's great points. I do want to clarify that the Nuns monument in D.C. was federally financed. That Jolly got the federal government to pay for that by calling them on the fact that these were enlisted. But yes, it's a great question, and I don't know. The National Monument Audit, the full report is fascinating. It has some of that data about who's paying and who's doing those things. But it's a great points.
I have two things. Angela Drive right here, is that named after Mother Angela Gillespie, do you think?
Yes, it is. Yes, and so I tell my students, so that my students are always crossing Angela Boulevard to get to Eddy Street Commons, where Five Guys and Chipotle and all that stuff are. So, so I always tell them that they don't necessarily know that it is named after Mother Angela, but that's not. I think the St. Mary's colleagues would agree that's not something that's conventionally known.
Yeah, when I was just on it today, I said to the person I was with, oh, this is named after Mother Angela Gillespie, blah, blah. Just assuming. Then, don't we have the statue of a sister in Statuary Hall in the Capitol?
Yes.
Paraso, the architect from the Northwest. There's one.
That's true. Yes. 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 Yeah. Yeah. No, it's not that there are no sisters, and of course we have our the Ruma, Illinois one, which was is fairly recent. So this is in the National Monument audit. It's comprehensive, but it's not absolutely complete. It was more concerned with frequency of representations than documenting every single one. Yeah. Yes, please. Oh, there she is.
I'd like to thank you for your beautiful and informative talk today. I just couldn't help but notice a certain group kind of missing in there. I see the program, so it's not a protest or anything. But I was wondering, not only is it less women, and it's even less people of color, and to be specific, Black people, like it's a little window stained glass, and the social concern hall of St. Martin de Porres. I was wondering, is it any Holy Cross nuns that's Black have made an impact in the organization now or forever? Are they yet to have their first, or what's the deal with that? It's blatant. It's kind of blatant. I see a few sisters back there, and I see myself. And it's just like this missing piece. And it's nuns that have founded organizations, and it's few up for canonization to become saints and whatnot. And I just wonder, where does Holy Cross sisters fit in there?
In the narrative of Sisters of Color? Yeah, that's not a question that I haven't. I'm actually not a historian of the Sisters of the Holy Cross. This is my first. I'm kind of dipping my toe into this here. I do know on campus there are some representations of Sister Thea Bowman, and I expect them to be more. Sister Thea Bowman won Notre Dame's Latari Medal, which is the highest honor. Well, according to Notre Dame, the highest honor an American Catholic can receive. So it's a very so no. And yes, I mean my intention is that these are there's a problem, multifaceted problem with the public faces. I mean, the person I'm pinch hitting for, Diane Batts-Morrow, is an amazing historian of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, and her new work on this is bringing it more into the modern era. So she would have a better question. But yeah, no, I think that there's. I think too. I would love to find an indigenous, particularly a Potawatomi woman, that could be represented on campus as well. I know they're there because the missionaries talked about working with a woman, but so that's another initiative. But no, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Picture of, not picture, but mention in the Coleman Morris of Thea Bowman. I had the honor and pleasure of meeting her before she was.
We have a presentation on Thea Bowman. Is where is here yet? I don't have the program memorized. I'm sorry. This is, but we do have a presentation on Thea Bowman. So she would be one, and of course, there's work being done on the traditionally Black congregations, but also women who integrated white congregations as well. So there is research being done on this. Thank you for your question. Anything else? Please.
Okay, it's always fun to have the microphone and get to ask you a question. Kathy, that was a great presentation, and I have been thinking about throughout the whole presentation, kind of about these blurred lines with the Holy Cross Sisters between what is traditionally menial tasks for lay sisters and then the choir nuns. and how that might relate to kind of an exodus towards serving on the Civil War battlefield and reluctance to come back. I don't know if you found anything on that or you thought about that, but do you have...
Oh, and let me clarify. I didn't mean that they didn't come back. I meant that the numbers never rebounded. And because the Sisters of the Holy Cross were expanding their educational ministries very rapidly at that point. They were being asked to go serve in lots of places. So that was a supply problem, that they were no longer being able to do that. But no, many of them, Mother Angela, a lot of them actually came back to campus and came back to. But yeah, I think that's, I mean, this is a thread I wasn't able to unspool. But, there were sisters who were doing very menial tasks their entire lives, and then sisters like Mother Ascension, who by all accounts was the intellectual powerhouse behind Notre Dame. And so I think that is, and many scholars in this room can speak more authoritatively to this than them, but those distinctions and how they were negotiated and what how that played out in communities is an important consideration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can tell since the last time I heard about this, and it's been on my mind so much, and I'm so grateful for your research, both in Notre Dame Magazine and in this presentation. It was great to see that missive from the Honorable Rosie Rios, and I hope Notre Dame takes her up on that challenge. That leads me to a question that may be on the mind of others, and certainly is on my mind. What has responses looked like in the subsequent months? Have you, especially after that challenge from the Treasurer?
Well, I get a lot of emails from people who say, sign me up, I'll contribute to whatever. And I'm like, no, there's nothing, this is me, I just said this. I will say that, yes, there is an effort. Notre Dame announced last month that the main circle, which is when you drive up Notre Dame Avenue, the main circle will be redesigned to commemorate women on campus. We don't quite know yet what exactly that means. And again, who's going to make the decision about what it means? So that's really all I know right now. I did actually just yesterday, there's a group called Hesburgh Women of Impact who are all alums and are very interested in these kind of things. And they asked me to do a walking tour of spaces on campus featuring women. And I said, this is going to be a very short tour. We don't need to wear comfortable shoes, but it's all the spaces where they're not. So that's what I did. I did the spaces where they're not and where they should be. So I think people are fired up about it. I think that it's, but there's other ways our landscape needs to change. So I think it's initiating a conversation that I predict isn't going to move too quickly. But I do think that this organization and as historians, we can do it. I think, and this is Dan Horan from the Center for Spirituality at Notre Dame, and I think a key part of this is a partnership between St. Mary's and Notre Dame, because it is the sisters' story. It's the Sisters of the Holy Cross story. It's not Notre Dame's story to tell in important ways, and we need to be mindful of that. So I think this is just a great step. I love that this conference was at St. Mary's 3 years ago. It's here at Notre Dame. Where will it be 3 years from now? I mean, it would be great to think about a more sustained partnership with this, and so and I know you're interested in that conversation too. So thank you so much. Yes.
Thank you so much. Like everyone else, this is a fascinating topic. I'm wondering about the contextualization, because you ended your talk with this call for us to memorialize these women and to make them visible in the landscape. But how do we contextualize it so we can say, okay, we have women who were nurses, or served as spies during the Civil War, but also enslaved, or came from slave-holding families. When we talk about missionary women in the late 19th century, they were colonizers. And how do we contextualize it so we aren't creating these models, these gorgeous models of women without the messy background?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question. We just be ever mindful that any kind of public recognition is a statement of power. And so how do we recognize our own power? How do we think imaginatively about this? You know, it's not just about that is a very, let's just put a statue up of a general, you know. I mean, can we think more imaginatively about spaces and how we do that and how we include? And that's where, you know, I reached the limits of my own imagination. And so one of my suggestions to the Notre Dame administration was that we actually think about, this suggestion did not go over very well, but I wanted to think about a competition, introducing a competition for people who understand landscapes certainly better than I do. And how could we, you know, I think about Maya Lin and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, you know, where's our Maya Lin? How can we think about that? What if it's designed by a person of color? The log chapel that I showed, that was a replica that was primarily constructed by a former enslaved man. We don't talk about that either. So I think there's a lot of ways, and I think including as many voices in the conversation. Again, I mean, who decides? Is this, okay, so the administration says, great, we're going to recognize women. Which women, in what way? Who gets to answer those questions? So it's a great point. Yeah, thank you. Yes, Carol?
At this point in time, with the technology, I'm wondering if we don't start in the physical space, but we start in the digital space.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
In this case, or any of our websites, but we'll go with what you focused on in terms of putting these stories out there and getting them known, at least in the virtual world.
Okay. The question is digital landscapes, not just physical landscapes.
Yeah,
yes.
starting with the digital landscape, getting information out on these individuals, about including the context in many cases, obviously not just a bio of woman X who did this, but I think, or even a discussion of the importance of the fact that domestic work is always invisible, whether it's done at Notre Dame or whether it's done in any part of the world. So contextualizing, but also talking about some of these individuals, some of these women, these Holy Cross women for Notre Dame that have done these things, getting it out there so there's at least some familiarity, there's some recognition of their presence, and then using that as a way to spearhead potentially physical space honors of sorts. And that it just seems to me everybody very quickly goes to digital now, so maybe if that's a good starting point, then we can bring it back and anchor it within the physical space.
And you can, contextualization in terms of a digital space is much easier, much more real. I think there was one more question, and this is it could go on all night, so I'm going to discipline myself and say what I would say if I weren't the keynote speaker. I'd say this will have to be our last question. So,
thank you, Kathleen, and thank you for your presentation. I just want to pick up on the gentleman over there, the gentleman of color, and also my friend over here that spoke to the issue of, quite honestly, white congregations like my own, who we're doing our own study now, thanks to Shannon D. Williams, who helped us to realize that we did not accept women of color because they were not worthy. And so we're coming to that our own recognition in a very painful way. And I'm a sister of St. Joseph of Philadelphia, so we were at Gettysburg, we were in the flu and all of that. And we're very grateful that we had an opportunity to serve in that way. I'm wondering if even a connection with the National Black Sisters Conference, who will be here, as you know, at the end of July for their own annual assembly, at least it's a start that we're not actually replicating what we're currently critiquing. Because I do think the story of women religious is a story, but if it's only taken from one perspective, our monuments are going to have to be coming down in 50 years also, perhaps.
Well, and they will. I mean, monuments will change, and I think this is ultimately an empowering thing, that this is a moment when we can think more expansively and we can incorporate what we know and the painful aspects of this. And I think, but yes, I mean, surely what are our blind spots today that we're not seeing that we're going to recognize? So absolutely, I agree 100%. All right, well, I'm going to stop this now and just again, welcome everybody. I did want to mention, I wanted to thank Jean McManus. There is an exhibit in the Rare Books and Special Collections in Hesburgh Library. I know we have a jam-packed schedule. It's wonderful, so many wonderful things, but I hope we will have some time to walk around campus, also to get over to the library, which is pretty easy to find, but please just ask someone from the Cushwa Center or from Notre Dame if you need help finding it. Jean, is there anything else I should say about that, the exhibit?
The very compact exhibit is in the rare books and special collections. The very compact exhibit, sort of inspired by this conference, is in the rare books and special collections, which is down a hallway that is under construction, so it's really hard to find. The library's open Monday through Friday, so if you make your way over there, if you enter from the side, the west doors of the concourse into the library, you'll see a sign for special collections. Find your way in there. It's right now in one upright case, and we have a couple of we're limited by what we have in the archives, and so inspired by the thought of Diane Batts-Morrow giving the keynote, which changed, I located what items we had relating to the Oblate Sisters of Providence in St. Louis. That was a later instance of their work. The Sisters of Loretto, and the excellent article in the American Catholic Studies newsletter referencing their fairly recent reconciliation and a monument. So we have that in there. And then some items relating to Sister Thea Bowman and the Lead Me, Guide Me hymnal that was published in 1987. And we had a lovely discovery in the archives, which includes the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus records. And we found a volume in there that relates to, it looks like maybe it was the book launch for the hymnal, where participants signed the book to show that they were there, including Sister Thea Bowman. So that's a kind of special thing that we found. Just tiny vignettes that relate to all the stories that you all are working on.
Well, thank you again for that, Jean. I'm going to ask Shane or Madonna, is there anything else I need to announce now, or are we? Okay, well, I'm just going to celebrate that we finished on time and no tornado in sight. This is wonderful. Thank you again. Thanks and welcome.